Hi readers, welcome back to my channel. Lee here, and I am doing a January reading wrap up. Now it's the 29th of January when I'm filming this. Got the day off, so I might as well do it. There are two books that I have not finished yet, but they'll be included in this wrap up because one of them I certainly will finish before the end of the year, inshallah. And the other one it might tip over into February, but not by much. So earlier this month, I did kind of a mid-month recap, and I talked about the first 4 or 5 books in this post, and so I won't go do a deep dive in them, but I'll mention them here. I'm also going to talk about some DNFs I had and some struggles I had this month, and potentially some ideas of what to read next month. So I started the month with One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This was a fun way to start the year and the month. It was a YA fantasy, a little bit dark. There's some romance in there, but it's not as romance/sex heavy as a lot of YA fiction. Nothing against that, but I just prefer a little more subtlety. I sandwiched... sorry, wrong phrase. The next book I read was Forgetting by Frederica Amalia Finkelstein. This was a very, very weird book. I don't know how I feel about it. I did a whole review on that. It was a decent read. Just plop those on the floor. Next up, I finished up the duology of The Shepherd King, and that with Two Twisted Crowns. Again, really good. I believe there was a twist in there that I wasn't expecting, but a good, wholesome YA. Loved it. Fantasy. Next up, I read Like a Love Story. I was inspired to read this because Abdi Nazemian wrote another one of my favorite books of last year, and it is Only This Beautiful Moment. I preferred that book to this. That one read a little bit older. This one really read young, and it kind of gave me some teenage angst feelings that I did not want to relive. Next up, first half of the month, I read The Magic of Lemon Drop Pie. This was a really sweet book. And she's got another one that just came out. I can't remember the name of it. If I see it around, maybe I'll pick it up. But this was a good palate cleanser. Now we're going to get to the books I have not already talked about this month. First of all, I love a good horror, although I don't expect any horror to scare me at all. This Wretched Valley didn't scare me, by Jenny Kiefer. I know people will probably, if they watch this video, dog me on this, but this to me was reminiscent of The Shining. And what I mean by that is really this focused on mental evil, or evil that invades your mind and starts talking to you and makes you act out of character or in character. Maybe it makes your true character come out. I knew how this would end because it begins with the ending, but there were some twists, and I had me rooting for one of these characters. Really atmospheric. Really, I highly recommend this Wretched Valley if you like horror. It was a great book. One of my favorite reads this month, so that will go in a special place. Next up, I did a used bookstore haul, and I came across some Allison Brennan that I didn't have. This is the third in a trilogy. I have the first. I must have read it a long time ago, but I read the third just now. This was just okay. It kind of gave me what I needed at the moment. I've had a bit of a struggle this month when it comes to reading, and I'll talk about that after I finish the books that I finished. But this helped me realize it's not me, it is the books that I was choosing. Next up, I read The Garden of Lost Secrets by Kelly Bowen. I enjoyed this book tremendously. Let me backpedal a little bit. I did not enjoy it tremendously. I enjoyed it. There was dual timelines, but I felt that the more recent timeline didn't get the attention that the old timeline did. And I thought it was just something to help move the story along, but it really didn't. So just okay for me. I've got another book of hers. I'll give it a shot, but I won't pick up any more probably. Next up, again, When I Knew It Wasn't Me, The Heiress by Rachel Hawkins. This flew by, whereas The Garden of Lost Secrets did not. It was kind of a crawl. This has short chapters, interesting characters, a fucked up family, and I love that. This is a whole mystery. Again, there's a twist at the end, but I loved this writer's voice. I've got another book by Rachel Hawkins called The Villa, and I will probably bump that up on my reading list for the first 6 months of this year. Plop. Again, I had thought that I was struggling, not with The Heiress, but with some other books that I did not finish, and then I came across The Daydreams by Laura Hankin. Loved it. Short chapters, twisty bits, there was a sub-theme that I thought was genius. It was about mourning doves. And this gave me so much Britney Spears vibes, because it's really a treatise on how Hollywood treats girls and women, young women and women, and how toxic it is for them. I can't imagine growing up in the spotlight. But yeah, big time Britney Spears vibes, which I had already had because I read via audiobook her memoir last year. The next book I read was That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon, and almost put it down, but I was determined not to DNF another book. And also, once I got past the first chapter and into her writing style, it was a lot easier to read. But the worst thing I could say about this book is that it seemed very simple. And I've read YA books and children's books that were much more elevated. This was just an okay book. I will not read anything of hers again. Finally, I will be finishing this year with my nonfiction selection. Should finish this up in the next day or two. In the Garden of Beasts by Erik Larson. Love, Terror, an American Family in Hitler's Berlin. This is about William Dodd, who becomes America's first ambassador to Hitler's Germany in a year that proved to be a turning point in history, 1933. This book inadvertently led me to this book, Resistance Women, which I just started last night. I haven't even got very far, but I will finish it up. If not on the 31st, then the 1st. This is 500 pages, and it is a bit of a slower read, but this is about Mildred Fish Harnack, and who also plays a bit part in this book. And that leads me to my February nonfiction read, which is lost in the sauce now. Oh, it's right in front of my face. My February nonfiction read is going to be All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, which was written by Mildred Fish Harnack's great-great-niece. And it is about her experiences as part of the German resistance, as a leader in the German resistance. And I will be featuring Mildred Fish Harnack in my Women in War series for the end of February. Now, let's talk about things that didn't work and why they didn't work. And I really, I'm getting better about it, but when I DNF, especially 3 books in 1 month, I start to beat myself up. And I wonder, am I suffering from reading burnout? Or is it me? Am I the problem? But I don't think it is, because, again, the Heiress and the Daydreams. I just raced through those. I fell into the story, and I could not fall into the story with Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. I have not officially DNF'd this on Goodreads yet, but I'm not going to pick it back up. Now, in the introduction, the writer who wrote the introduction in 2005 talks about Sinclair Lewis, had been simmering with materials for several years as he recognized with increasing alarm the dangers that threatened democratic institutions. Unfortunately, his writing displays the haste in which he wrote, and so did the book's reviews. One reviewer complained about the novel's loose, melodramatic plot, flat and even corny characters, weak cliché dialogue, padded political discourse, awkward sentimentality, and heavy-handed satire and irony. And that's part of it. The writing style was just did not work for me, and it got to be painful to read in a way that sometimes when books are written in a, I'll say foreign language, but really 1935, they spoke differently than we do now. So I thought that was part of it, tried to push through, but again, it got to be physically painful, and I think that introduction was kind of a warning. So, disappointed that this was a DNF because it really had some great premise. It's going to go officially DNF today on Goodreads. The next up, I wrote little notes to tell me why they were DNFs. And this one is Hatchet Girls by Diana Rodriguez Wallach. Again, I wanted this to be good. The premise is great. It's about a girl whose brother is accused of hatcheting two people to death. It takes place in the same town that Lizzie Borden lived, and it should have been great. However, I was going to do a post or video including some books that my mother had, but I chose not to. What finally, there's always something. What finally made me shut this down was the overuse of dialect. And that's why I didn't bring in those books on my memorial video. Dialect, when done well, can be good, and it can add to the story. In fact, I found when I read books where dialect is done well, at some point, I don't no longer see it. I just hear the voices in my head the way it's supposed to be. But when it's not done well, it can be demeaning to a character or a particular type of people. This book had a character who they had a Massachusetts accent in all his words, but he was the only one that spoke with that accent in her writing. And that was just what finally pushed me over the edge, and I was like, no, I'm done. Also, it was hard to read before that, and that was just the last straw. Finally, a big pet peeve of mine is when writers tell, don't show, not show. And that is what I felt like when I started reading Sisters Under the Rising Sun. This has really made me sad because I wanted to fall into the story. This is a great story about women who were held by the Japanese in POW camps, and I believe that attention ought to be brought to women who've had that experience, but it was just disappointing. It was all about writing style, and that's one thing that I found in all three of those books, is that the writing style can make or break a book for me. Sorry, pause for a little Carmex break. Okay, so normally I do not do this, but I want to finish up with some things that I might read next month. I'm not going to commit myself because I know how I am, but these are high on my list, and they are in no particular order, just the order that I stacked them up in. The Removed by Brennan Hobson. I bought this during Native American Heritage Month, I believe, this year, and I have not read it yet. This is about family trauma. In the 15 years since their teenage son Ray Ray was killed in a police shooting, the Akota family has been suspended in private grief. The mother, Maria, increasingly struggles to manage the onset of Alzheimer's in her husband. Their daughter leads a solitary life, punctuated only by spells of dizzying romantic obsession, and their remaining son, Edgar, fled home long ago, turning to drugs to mute his feelings of alienation. The family's annual bonfire is approaching, and the mother, Maria, attempts to call the family together, but as it draws near, each of them feels a strange blurry of the boundary between normal life and the spirit world. I believe this is billed as maybe a horror, but I'm not sure. So, that's on the, maybe I'll read that in February list. Next up is a kind of palate cleanser. It is I want to say rom-com, but there might not be any com in this, but it's a romance called The 7-Year Slip. In this, Clementine West is trying to stay grounded and keep her heart safe, but then she moves into her late aunt's apartment and finds a strange man sitting in the kitchen, a man with kind eyes, a southern drawl, and a taste for lemon pies. And then her well-laid plans begin to fall apart, because he's the type of man who, before it all, she would have fallen head over heels for, and she still might. Except, he exists in the past. 7 years in the past, to be exact. And she, quite literally, leaves 7 years in his future. So this seems like a really fun book. I love books that play with time. And it also should be a good palate cleanser between a more difficult book and something else. Next up, I heard about this from Mother Horror on Instagram. It is The Whistling by Rebecca Netley. Again, I love a good horror. When Elspeth arrives on a remote Scottish island to become a nanny to a young child, she hopes to bond with her, until she learns that the girl has not spoken for months, and Mary's silence isn't the only mystery. Hypnotic lullabies drift down empty corridors. Strange dolls appear in abandoned rooms, and as the night draws in, darker questions arise. What happened to Mary's late twin, William? Why did their previous nanny disappear so suddenly? And is the whistling Elspeth hears at night just the storm outside? Or is it something else? Or is something else out there? If you can hear it, it's already too late. Next up is probably going to be up there early days of February. And that is The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I picked this up, I think I was having a conversation with somebody on Instagram and comment section. I think it might have been Craft Brewed Cam, not sure. But I picked this up when I was up in Raleigh to pick up a different book, and this first line of this is why I want to read this really soon. Long before we discovered that he had fathered 2 children by 2 different women, one in Drimoleague and one in Clonakilty, Father James Monroe stood on the altar of the Church of Our Lady, Star of the Sea, in the parish of Goleen, West Cork, and denounced my mother as a whore. I love that first line. It is great. So I'm going to read a little bit from the back of this. Cyril Avery is not a real Avery, or at least that's what his adopted parents tell him, and he never will be. But if he isn't a real Avery, then who is he? Born out of wedlock to a teenage girl cast out from her rural Irish community and adopted by a well-to-do, if eccentric Dublin couple via the intervention of a hunchbacked redemptorist nun, Cyril is adrift in the world, anchored only tenuously by his heartfelt friendship with the infinitely more glamorous and dangerous Julian Woodbead. At the mercy of fortune and coincidence, he will spend a lifetime coming to know himself and where he came from. Anyway, this looks real good, and I love this first line. Finally, I am hesitant to read this even though I bought it. It's about Afghanistan, and I try to distance myself in nonfiction reading from Afghanistan because it can either break my heart or make me mad. The worst criticisms of this, though, that I've heard was that it was boring. We'll see. But the reason I chose this to put up in the February Potentials is because Philip Fracassi, who wrote one of my favorite books, A Child Alone with Strangers, he just read this and recommended it, wrote a great review on it, so I may give it a shot. I read a couple of lines. It does look like it's not going to be a fast read, but I'll give it a shot. Anywho, that's all for me. I hope you've enjoyed this recap. I'd love to hear what you're reading or want to read or any suggestions. Happy reading!